Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. For the first time, we turn to the Caucasus. In many ways, the Caucasus is something of a no man's land, a region in between and set apart. Lying between Asia and Europe, Russia and Iran, the Muslim world and the Christian, the Caucasus is simultaneously all of these things, but none of them entirely. And it's the founding father of modern Georgia, one of the Caucasian countries, that's the focus of our discussion today. Zviad Gamsakhurdia, son of Georgia's finest 20th century writer, grew up in the shadow of Stalinism, and every day of his life was dedicated to freeing his people from the yoke of Russian rule. Whilst he achieved this, Georgia became an independent country in 1991, with Gamsakhurdia as its first president. The Georgia he presided over was a hellish place, ripped apart by civil war, organised crime, and militia violence. Sadly, Gamsakhurdia cannot be acquitted in all of this as a placeholder. His commitment to an ethnically homogenous Georgia, in a part of the world anything but, was always going to lead to problems. Gamsakhurdia's own life ended in a Tblisi bunker in 1993, probably by suicide, and is a rather sordid reflection of how Georgia's own utopian dream for its future died on its feet in the early 1990s. Listening to my guest today, Gamsakhurdia reminded me of two former subjects on this podcast: the Welsh nationalist leader Saunders Lewis and the Serb dictator Slobodan Milosevic, both of whom also had a no-holds-barred and blunt approach to nationalism. Thankfully, the country has taken a different and cannier path to self-government since then, and is a relative success story among the post-Soviet states. My guest for this conversation is Tom de Waal. Tom is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and is one of the leading authorities on the Caucasus region. I would highly recommend his book, The Caucasus: An Introduction, for anyone looking to read up on this amazing and enigmatic part of our continent. As well as Gamsakhurdia's life, Tom and I discussed the bizarre interplay between Stalinism and Georgian nationalism, Georgia's place in Europe, and how a country and a region so far away from the capitals of diplomacy has forged relations with the great world powers. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Zviad Gamsakhurdia. Hi Tom, how are you?
Hi Tom. Yes, two Toms talking. Good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you as well. Tom, we're talking about Zviad Gamsakhurdia today. He is in many ways seen as the founding father of the modern Georgian state. He was born in 1939. What I think we have to set up straight away, really, is what was happening in Georgia at the time of his birth. Georgia was a republic within the Soviet Union. At that point, Joseph Stalin, a Georgian himself, of course, was leader of the Soviet Union. I think this has to be examined first because Georgia's place within the Soviet or Russian Empire was no ordinary imperialist dominion relationship. Can you shed a bit of light on that relationship in the abstract, as it relates not to Gamsakhurdia, first of all?
Sure. Well, of course, Georgia is and has been an independent kingdom or republic for many periods in its history, and proudly has a history which predates Russia, adopted Christianity in the 5th century and so on. But for the last 200-300 years, Russia has been the main foreign power in Georgia's neighborhood. So Georgia, part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, brief period of independence really only lasted 2 years between 1918 and 1920, and then part of the Soviet Union. But as you say, a kind of very interesting and rather problematic story of Georgia and the Soviet Union and I kind of see the history of the Soviet Union as a kind of history of lots of kind of cascading power, dominions and hierarchies, in which certainly Georgian nationalism was suppressed, but in other ways, Georgia was also within the Soviet context, and particularly within the context of Stalin, a Georgian, given quite a lot of privileges within the Soviet Union. Certainly no democratic privileges, but within that kind of pecking order of the Soviet Union, Georgia at various points didn't do so badly. There's actually a new book out on this subject called Georgian and Soviet. I haven't read it, I've just read the reviews, but it looks terrific, by Claire Kaiser, about this kind of weird situation Georgia found itself in Soviet times, of both being kind of colonized and colonizer at the same time. So, and Gamsakhurdia, who we're talking about, is born squarely within that period, and is one of many Georgians who have this feeling that Georgia is an exceptional place, an exceptional nation, which is oppressed by Russia, but also partakes of some of the privileges that Georgia had because of the Soviet Union.
Gamsakhurdia's family seemed like a family whose status and image of themselves was constructed primarily around being intellectuals and being thinkers. They were also quite a prominent family and had quite a lot of connections. What sort of a sort of young childhood did this look like inside the Soviet Union?
Well, I think to understand Gamsakhurdia, you need to know a bit about his father, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia, and who was basically Georgia's, best-known novelist, I think, of the 20th century. It's fair to say. Sounds like he was quite a domineering father, so a big act to live up to. So there's probably a bit of an Oedipal relationship there as well. Konstantin Gamsakhurdia studied in Germany, was a big fan of Nietzsche, and so there's also this rather kind of dramatic good and evil story playing out in his life and work, which also centers around the idea of Georgia, again, as this great exceptional nation.
Gamsakhurdia became a dissident when he was very young, when he was in his kind of early to mid-teens. Do you think this was something the circumstances in Georgia caused him to become? Or was this a sort of character trait, do you think? Did he kind of come out of the womb a troublemaker and a dissident? Could he have been born in leafy Surrey and been like this? No disrespect to people in Surrey who are listening, but it's just not a very likely place to produce a revolutionary.
Well, he was certainly a revolutionary, radical personality who, I guess, in leafy Surrey would have expressed it rather differently, but within the context of Georgia and the Soviet Union, became a dissident Georgian nationalist, and this is the story of his whole biography, of his whole career, and so it was both by character and by circumstance. I think it was pretty inevitable that he would end up a dissident and end up, as he did, in jail in the Soviet Union.
This was the mid-1950s. Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev, who I'm doing a podcast on soon, started orchestrating the so-called thaw, where Stalin's totalitarianism was denounced in some aspects. One of the fascinating things is that there were big demonstrations denouncing the thaw, so-called de-Stalinization, in Georgia in 1956. And these took on, among some people, a kind of pan-Georgian feel. Did many of the people protesting sort of conflate Stalinism with Georgian separatism or Georgian nationalism against Khrushchev?
Weird as that sounds, I think, yes, they did. So these demonstrations in 1956 in Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, against the Khrushchev secret speech, the Khrushchev thaw, which were brutally put down. Dozens of people probably died. There's a plaque you can still see in the centre of Tbilisi commemorating the people who died. So it started as a kind of demonstrations, in support of Stalin and against Khrushchev. and then sort of escalated into kind of broader Georgian nationalist, anti-Russian feeling at the same time, it's kind of weird for those of us who know even a little bit of history, because Stalin was in many ways he was a Georgian who kind of adopted Russia, became a sort of a Georgian who saw Russia as the great imperial nation which would elevate Georgia, and which would, one of the founders of the Soviet Union. So it's a bit of a stretch to regard him as pro-Georgian and anti-Russian. But that's indeed how many of the demonstrators obviously saw Stalin as their Georgian, founding father figure. And that's how the demonstrations played out. And the young Gamsakhurdia, I think, came to political activism thanks to those protests and those horrible killings on the streets of Tbilisi.
I mean, there's a bit of an irony in those protests that they were against Khrushchev's thaw, but the protests themselves were made possible by the thaw, but they were against the thaw. I mean, that's a bit
it is totally weird, and I think to go into that, one has to go into kind of Georgia's relationship with Stalin. And, there's obviously big splits within Georgian society. The Georgian educated intellectual class, as a rule, finds Stalin abhorrent, sees him as someone who betrayed his nation, who destroyed its intellectual classes and so on. But, others also see him as a great Georgian who built a great empire, sort of more Soviet patriotic types. So there's this kind of feeling of perception of Stalin as a kind of abusive parent figure in Georgia, and you see opinion polls. I did a whole project on this back in 2013, where we did surveys in Georgia and in Russia comparing attitudes to Stalin, and very, very broadly quite positive attitudes to Stalin amongst a lot of Georgians, even Georgians who simultaneously say that they approve of democracy and Georgian independence. So completely paradoxical views there.
And do you think that Gamsakhurdia was guilty of that cognitive dissonance himself, or did he take a slightly more nuanced?
Well, no, I don't think he was guilty of that cognitive dissonance. Gamsakhurdia was pretty consistent in his view of Georgian nationhood as Russia as the evil empire. That's the thread that goes right through his biography, right through his career. In many ways, he didn't do nuance at all. He was an ethno-nationalist.
If you look at the 60s and the early 70s as Gamsakhurdia became an adult, what sort of tactics did he use to further the cause of Georgian nationalism? We've mentioned him as a dissident. What does that actually mean?
Well, it means fairly modest, stuff. In those days, we're talking about, famous samizdat literature, where you would publish, literature which was banned and distribute it. You would have little meetings here and there to discuss censored and banned aspects of history. And in this case, obviously, it's about Georgian history. It's about Georgian literature, all that had been the kind of parts of Georgian culture which had been marginalized or censored by the Soviet regime. He was, my Georgian, unfortunately, is still rather basic. I speak a little, but I don't read it. Gamsakhurdia, by all accounts, was a very eloquent speaker and writer of Georgian, and also translated a lot. He translated Shakespeare, apparently. No, he did translate Shakespeare into Georgian, apparently, in his last hours in the bunker in this Georgian civil war. He was apparently, there with King Lear, people say, in the bunker. So he was also, that was the sort of thing he was doing, which he saw as an act of defiance against Soviet rule.
One of the things that's worth pointing out, and that sort of the sort of translation and the writing reveals, is that he sort of kept quite an academic head on things during his adult life. Do you think in terms of what he envisaged the struggle against Soviet domination looking like, was there any sort of taking up arms approach in this period?
Not really. I think there was no prospect, there was no capacity to fight the Soviet regime with arms, with weapons, whatever. I think last resistance there may have been to the Soviet regime had really died out in the 1920s and 30s. This was much more a kind of political, intellectual resistance.
Was he religious? I mean, Georgia has its kind of own sort of orthodox church. Did religion form a big part of the Georgian identity, as Gamsakhurdia saw it?
Yes, I think it did. I think there's Georgian nationalism sees the Georgian church as a kind of foundational structure, a foundational institution, and still does. The patriarch is still, in almost all opinion polls, is the most trusted and beloved figure in Georgia, regardless of who that person is, although it's been the same patriarch now for 40 years, in fact. So yes, for Gamsakhurdia, Georgian orthodoxy and the Georgian nation were the same. And therefore, by extension, anyone who didn't speak Georgian and wasn't Georgian Orthodox wasn't a proper Georgian.
Somebody we should probably introduce now is Eduard Shevardnadze, who became leader of the Georgian Soviet Republic in 1972. He later became the president of independent Georgia, as we'll find out in the 1990s. What sort of politician was Shevardnadze?
Shevardnadze was a Soviet politician from a fairly ordinary workers' family. Grew up in western Georgia on the Black Sea coast. Someone who, grew up. He's the Gorbachev generation, so he grew up after the worst of Stalinism and made a career under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. And rose through the ranks to become, as you say, the leader of the Georgian Communist Party. I'd have to get this right. I think it was 1972, but was a real pragmatist, someone who was not a hardliner. He tried to crack down on corruption, which was distinguished him from other Soviet national leaders. He encouraged Georgian culture to the extent he could. The Georgian film industry was one of the most successful in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Georgian language film. Famously in 1978, there were demonstrations in Tbilisi when there was an attempt to change the Soviet constitution and downgrade Georgian language as the language of the Georgian Soviet Republic. Seemed a slightly kind of technical thing, but it was a huge matter of pride for Georgians. And Shevardnadze, as he himself personally told me in an interview years later, managed that in a way that he kind of encouraged the demonstrations in order to show the leadership in Moscow that needed to happen, and Georgian was reinstated as the language of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. So he was a pragmatist, but obviously someone who was also, a Soviet leader who cracked down on the dissidents, including Gamsakhurdia, who was hated by them. But of course is best known as the man who was friends with Gorbachev. They had a famous walk along the beach on the Black Sea coast in the early 1980s, when they had a chance to talk one-on-one. That they said and confided in one another, said it can't go on like this. And when Gorbachev then came to power in 85, he plucked Shevardnadze from Georgia and made him his foreign minister. And so, Shevardnadze then became the kind of, in terms of foreign policy, that the man, was the face of the liberalizing Soviet Union, of perestroika, the man who helped end the Cold War from the Soviet side. There
were many republics within the Soviet Union that were set up as part of this sort of federal system, essentially to manage this kind of sprawling empire. Again, if you look at that sort of time period, I know you said that there was relatively limited real resistance within the Georgian Republic to Soviet rule. If you take a kind of comparative approach and think about the other small republics, how difficult was it to manage compared to the others?
Well, I think, let's remember the mid-1980s when Gorbachev came to power. No one was predicting the end of the Soviet Union. Only a few, maybe radical dissidents in the West. Solzhenitsyn was predicting that the threat to the Soviet Union might come from China, might come from Muslims in Central Asia. No one was talking about the Baltic states, Georgia, Ukraine. And so, most people got that badly wrong. Most Soviet citizens were more or less happy with the Soviet Union. And indeed, many of them, opinion polls in the 1990s showed that many of them, people not just in Russia, but in other republics too, regretted the end of the Soviet Union. So I think it wasn't that hard to manage, but then the weaknesses came when Gorbachev started with glasnost, which sort of suddenly exposed the rottenness of the system. It allowed criticism. It suddenly showed up corruption. And it suddenly also exposed the fact that different parts of the Soviet Union were incredibly different from one another, that there'd been this kind of Soviet-era nationalism in places like Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, where local leaders had actually amassed quite a lot of sovereignty for themselves and had a huge amount of bargaining power. So that was that. I think the Soviet Union, we talk about a collapse, but it was also in many ways a divorce. It was a divorce of these kind of national leaders who decided that they wanted to split off from the center and amass more power for themselves. And suddenly 15 Soviet republics suddenly became 15 independent nations, with bloodshed, of course, but with, compared to obviously to places like Yugoslavia, comparatively little bloodshed. One of the the least bloody breakups of an empire in modern history.
To catch up with Gamsakhurdia's story through the 70s and 80s, it's probably worth mentioning the Helsinki groups. What were the so-called Helsinki groups?
Well, this dates to 1975, the Helsinki Final Act, signed by the Soviet Union, which is about European security, but it's also about human rights, in which the Soviet Union commits itself to certain, human rights principles, and then dissident groups latch onto this and say, well, we're going to try and hold our government to account by forming these Helsinki groups, pointing out that the Soviet leadership does not fulfill the obligations it signed up to in Helsinki. Andrei Sakharov was probably the most famous dissident who used that tactic, but many others did as well, including Gamsakhurdia. And I think one problem with this was that it became hard for outsiders to distinguish amongst these dissidents, amongst these Helsinki groups, who was, fighting for democracy and who was fighting for an ethno-nationalist, in fact, and what in many cases turned out to be an anti-democratic agenda. The Soviet Union was in many ways an empire. Towards the end, it was a fairly much more light repressive empire compared to what it had been earlier. But there are different enemies of empire, as we know from history. There's the enemy, the opponents of empire who are Democrats and liberals, and there are the opponents of empire who are ethno-nationalists who want to, pull their nation out of this empire, but do not necessarily believe in democracy and certainly do not believe often in the rights of their minorities in this new ethno-national construct that they're trying to build. And Gamsakhurdia obviously falls into that category.
Yes. The reason we need to bring in the Helsinki groups, really, is that their establishment led to a crackdown on them in the Soviet Union in 77, 78. And Gamsakhurdia was arrested, and then there was then quite a bizarre trial, which I've sort of read some of the accounts of it, and it reads a bit like a show trial, really.
Yes, I mean, so Gamsakhurdia was arrested along with a few others. The other famous dissident was Merab Kostava, and was jailed. And then, notoriously, Gamsakhurdia did a kind of recantation of his beliefs publicly, and others held that against him. I think I would hesitate, sitting in a comfortable democratic country, to hold that against him, because goodness knows what pressure he was put under, his family was put under. But that certainly was what happened, and Georgia being a land of conspiracy theories, that led to persistent conspiracy theories amongst Gamsakhurdia's political opponents that he had somehow done a deal with the KGB.
The 80s was ultimately the decade where things changed for Georgia and for Georgian nationalism. But you've spoken about glasnost and perestroika. It seems as if the catalyst for that change came from Moscow, not from Tbilisi. When I was sort of reading about Gamsakhurdia, if you look at 1956 and the de-Stalinisation protests, they were obviously, as you said, put down in a pretty brutal way. But then you have this kind of 30 years among the nationalists and people who ascribe to their beliefs of dissident writing, academia. These were indirect. I mean, the writing that they were doing themselves itself wasn't direct. It was very evocative. But there wasn't this kind of armed struggle and an attempt to really cause the Soviet Union problems. Do you think that Gamsakhurdia, when he looked back at the end of his life on how he treated the Soviet Union, do you think there was perhaps a slight regret? Do you think maybe he thought he'd been a bit timid?
Goodness knows. Well, personally, talking about regret, I should voice my own regret, which is that I didn't ever manage to meet Gamsakhurdia. I can tell you that I came a bit close when I visited Grozny before the first Chechen war, but he'd just left a couple of months ago when he was in exile. So I never, what I hear about him is what I read and from people who met him, but none of them talk of a man who had much self-doubt or regret. This was a man who believed, evidently from childhood, from his father, from everything, he believed that he was a man sent to save Georgia, and that all the actions he took were correct.
Perhaps, though, if you think about the April 9th tragedy in, I think, 1989, this was another brutal sort of put down of an expression of Georgian nationalism during the Gorbachev era, right in the dying days of the Soviet Union. And actually, it seems in some ways that 25 people dying on the streets of Tbilisi, it actually was a moment where people woke up and sort of smelt the coffee. It perhaps shows that actually, had that sacrifice been made slightly earlier, things could have perhaps changed. And again, I completely share your reticence in sort of drawing maybe glib conclusions about the sort of bravery that's required here. But it seems as if it was a very reactive movement, Georgian nationalism.
That's right. I mean, I think this is generally the story of the end of the Soviet Union is that these national movements formed, and there were, isolated episodic crackdowns. The worst was in Baku in January 1990. But then, these national movements in a way didn't have to do that much except wait for the whole system to crumble by itself. There were no wars of liberation. This was just the system crumbled, it broke up into its 15 constituent parts, with comparative, I use the word comparative lack of bloodshed. and there's quite a lot of literature on this, on how from the Khrushchev period onwards, these Union republics, as they were known, had a lot of autonomy and had a lot of cultural autonomy. So there was these kind of nascent nationalism there. They had their historians, their academies of science, their little film industries, their literature, their intellectuals. So many of the elements of kind of nationhood were there already in the Soviet period, absent political freedoms, which then came with the Gorbachev period.
Georgia ultimately did leave the Soviet Union in 1991 via a referendum, and then in an election, Gamsakhurdia was elected president of Georgia. Was this a sort of, initially anyway, a tough fight for the presidency for Gamsakhurdia, or was he basically the only person who really wanted the job?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to dwell a little on April 9th, 1989, which you've already touched on. I think that was the pivotal moment in which the kind of Soviet Georgian leadership lost its legitimacy. I mean, in other of those republics, the local Communist Party hung on and became the new elite. That was the case in Ukraine. It was the case in most of Central Asia, and in Azerbaijan, for example. But in Georgia, there was this traumatic episode in which demonstrations on the streets of Tbilisi and Soviet troops coming in to break them up, and 20 people being killed, and the local leadership failed to respond properly, failed to prevent this, failed to condemn it properly. Edward Shevardnadze, flew in, but who I think would have done much more, but he was too late. And there was this huge feeling of trauma, which I think can't be overstated in Tbilisi. This was mainly women who were killed, actually, which made it, I think, extra traumatic that our people have been killed in cold blood on the streets of Tbilisi. And so overnight, a kind of evolutionary, more modest national movement became much more revolutionary. And at that point, people started talking about full independence. And Gamsakhurdia was the one who absolutely took advantage of that. He, I would say, rather cynically had a hand, one would say. I would be criticized by many in Georgia for saying this, but I think the evidence shows it to be the case that he and his fellow leaders, they had a chance to tell the demonstrators to go home, that they were in danger. The patriarch apparently came out onto the streets and told the demonstrators to go home. Gamsakhurdia said, no, we should stick it out, we will stay. And the troops came in and people died. So he had a kind of, a collateral role, if we can put it that way, in what happened, and then took advantage and became the national leader, and the kind of those who were in favour of a more evolutionary break with Moscow were vilified, which I think is a great shame, to be honest, because I think an evolutionary road would have been much better. For a gradual break with Moscow, with Gorbachev, would have been more in Georgia's interest, to be honest. And so the radicals took over, and then Gamsakhurdia won the first contested election in Georgia in 70 years in 1990, and then became president in 1991. But it was a hugely divisive period. There were many opposition groups. It was nationalism with a vengeance. It was by all accounts an extremely wild and crazy time. Many, if not most, of these groups had weapons. Many came from criminal fraternities. They were armed by bits of the Georgian mafia. So it was a wild time in Georgia in which the kind of radical, eloquent, national voice of Gamsakhurdia, someone who absolutely knew, found the words to talk about Georgian nationhood and the Russian enemy, struck a chord with the majority of people.
The theme of ethnic nationalism has run through the conversation so far, Georgia is not a country that is sort of ethnically homogenous. Can you go into the ethnic breakdown of Georgia a little bit, and then perhaps signal why this posed such an issue for Gamsakhurdia after he became president in 91?
And indeed before, absolutely, this is absolutely crucial. The Caucasus is a mosaic, not a melting pot, but a mosaic of nationalities, with these three big nations, Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis, but many other ethnic groups. And in Georgia, they kind of break down into Armenians and Azerbaijanis in Georgia, who didn't have any kind of autonomy within Georgia, but were substantial communities and still are. And then three groups in Georgia which had autonomy, were given autonomy in Soviet times: Abkhaz, Ossetians, and also Adjurans, who are these kind of Georgian Muslims down on the Black Sea coast. All three of these places, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Adjara, were zones of conflict in the early 20th century. There was wars there, which ended when the Bolsheviks took over and imposed this kind of authoritarian peace on them in 1920, and then were given autonomy in the Soviet period. So ethnic Georgians had to live with the fact that the Soviet Union had given autonomy to these minorities. That was fine with a lot of people. It was a kind of pragmatic arrangement. But for Georgian nationalists, this was, they regarded this as an anathema. They regarded this as the way that the empire, the Soviet Union, Moscow had set up these arrangements with them. They saw it as a kind of time bomb under their Georgian national project. And sure enough, when the Abkhaz and Ossetians started militating for their own national rights, the ethno-nationalists like Gamsakhurdia said this was a kind of plot by Moscow, and they had to be suppressed. So this was the other thing going on in the Caucasus at the time. The nation, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, trying to split from Moscow, and the minorities within those countries in turn militating for their own rights, and in some cases getting support from Moscow, and therefore being accused of being agents, fifth columnists of the center. And these are the conflicts and these are the problems that South Caucasus has been living with ever since then.
Gamsakhurdia was only president of Georgia for, I think, a year, perhaps at most. Is this, or are these ethnic tensions ultimately the reason why his presidency was so short, why it was such a disaster?
Yes and no. I mean, so Gamsakhurdia, just to continue this theme, was, a pure ethno-nationalist of the kind we also saw in the Balkans at the time, but maybe because Georgia was a bit further away, was less noticed. He referred to Abkhazians and Ossetians and indeed Armenians as guests, implying that they didn't have full civic rights. A friend of mine, he gave an interview to and said only. He floated this idea that only Georgians who could trace their ancestry back to 1801, which is when the Russians took over Georgia, the Russian Empire took over Georgia, should have full citizen rights in Georgia. So he was an extreme ethno-nationalist. He wasn't the only one. But he basically, when the Ossetians objected to his policies, he basically helped start a war in South Ossetia in 1990. And then, it was after he was deposed that another war started in Abkhazia in 1992, but he played a huge role in stoking those tensions, in setting up, encouraging Georgians to fight against these minorities. So that was one cause of violence and of his downfall. But the other thing was he was very divisive with Georgians themselves. There was this massive polarization. His opponents were quite radical, but he denounced basically anyone, as far as he was concerned in his public speeches. Anyone who opposed him was a agent of the Kremlin or a red intelligentsia or a criminal or a terrorist. And many of these people gave as good as they got. So, the nascent democracy in Georgia quickly broke down into a civil war, basically. And he, as you say, only lasted a year before these armed groups, some of them, with help of organised crime in Georgia, fought street battles and actually deposed him.
It's funny, really, when I was reading about his career, I almost got the impression that he'd kind of worked doggedly on this project his whole life and then got to the tree only to set it on fire. I mean, it's a bit of it's not a very eloquent phrase, but it's a bit of a letdown, really, isn't it? Or am I being a bit unfair?
Well, it's you could also call it a tragedy. Yeah. And he was a Shakespearean scholar after all. That he was a kind of Richard III well, maybe Richard III was a more cynical character. We would have to search for the right Shakespearean character, but someone who came to power and with this utopian dream and ended up pulling the whole thing down with him. A man who had no grasp of the economy, would make these bizarre statements about how, because of our wine and mineral water, we're going to turn into Switzerland overnight. Who just had this. He was a kind of nationalist intellectual who believed that there's by some kind of magical thinking that the Georgian nation would suddenly recover its historic birthright simply by being independent and getting rid of the Russians. And of course, it didn't happen that way, and it made actually Georgia a whole lot worse, unfortunately. And this, Georgia, we'll talk about that, I guess, in a moment. Georgia has, done comparatively well, but that's really despite Gamsakhurdia, certainly not because of him.
Yes, you mentioned the Balkans a second ago, and the comparisons are certainly there, that you have in the form of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia this sort of imperial style dictatorship and federal dictatorship that can sort of hold things together, but once it's lifted, all hell breaks loose among the different ethnic groups within Georgia and Yugoslavia. Shevardnadze came back ultimately to become the president of Georgia. Was it Shevardnadze's belief, given that obviously he'd gone to Moscow, as it were, in the 1980s, that did he see it as his role to kind of reassert that central control in order to sort of quell ethnic divisions at the periphery? Did he see it in that way, do you think?
Well, Shevardnadze became a different kind of nation builder, a much more pragmatic, cynical, one might say, but effective modern nation builder. One of these former Communist Party leaders, of whom there were several, Kravchuk in Ukraine, Haydar Aliyev in Azerbaijan, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, who took over their republics and started to make them, independent sovereign states. Some of these, Shevardnadze, one has to be said, was probably the most democratic of that bunch. Had the most democratic instincts and also pro-Western, mainly thanks to his, the friends he'd made as Soviet foreign minister, particularly in Germany, in the United States. So, he wasn't a visionary in the way that Gamsakhurdia was. But when he came back to Georgia in March 1992, it had descended from being a fairly prosperous, stable Soviet republic just a few years before into a kind of Somalia, basically, with warlords on the streets. One couldn't go out after 9 o'clock at night. There were power shortages. There was rampant violence. People were carrying guns, into shops and so on. And there was a civil war, which was fairly brutally waged by Shevardnadze and his friends against these so-called Zviadists, the supporters of Zviad Gamsakhurdia in Western Western Georgia. So there was basically a civil war going on for a couple of years within Georgia. But, I think Shevardnadze's legacy stands up well as a man who eventually managed to reimpose order on Georgia, a measure of democracy, and certainly make it a sovereign state, which was noticed by the West in particular.
Gamsakhurdia died in the midst of the civil war in 1993. He was 54. In circumstances about which relatively little seems to be known. Can you go into what is alleged to have happened to him?
Well, Gamsakhurdia, first of all, there was this, very bloody Tbilisi civil war, end of 1991, when Gamsakhurdia was overthrown, and the large parts of the centre of Tbilisi, beautiful streets, were destroyed. Dozens of people died, and then Gamsakhurdia fled. He turned up bizarrely in Chechnya. It was the kind of rebel province of Russia, as the guest of Johar Dudayev, the bizarre Chechen general who had proclaimed himself independent of Moscow. They had kind of common cause. They were very, very different personalities, but they had common cause in believing that Moscow was the root of all evil. I did meet Dudayev, but as I said, I was too late when I arrived there to meet Gamsakhurdia. I'm told that they used to, meet every evening, and someone who was there told me they used to play pool, and that Dudayev would win every time because he was the Air Force pilot and Gamsakhurdia was the Georgian intellectual and couldn't play pool, but that was the way that they passed their evenings, chatting about the evils of Russia and playing pool. Anyway, then the civil war continued in Georgia, and Gamsakhurdia made an attempt to come back. He landed in western Georgia, and started to try and fight Shevardnadze. With some help from the Russians, it seems that Shevardnadze managed to suppress that rebellion. And in these strange circumstances, Gamsakhurdia died. It seems he was kind of, most likely, he saw that the game was up, and he either committed suicide or possibly he instructed one of his bodyguards to shoot him, and that was the end of Zviad Gamsakhurdia.
How is he remembered in Georgia now?
Well, I think this is really the important question, and why, you and I need to still be having this conversation, that it's not just a kind of bizarre historical episode, because I think, Georgia has done pretty well since 1992, since the return of Shevardnadze. Three governments, all of which had big flaws, the Shevardnadze, Saakashvili, and then the current Georgian Dream government, but all of which have also moved Georgia forward, towards Europe, given it, quite a lot of democracy, albeit with these very kind of through these ruling parties who dominate the scene. But Georgia is, if you look around in the comparative landscape of that region, is still the most democratic country. And a good place to visit, and a place that should be quite proud of its achievements. And yet it does have skeletons in its cupboard, and one of those skeletons is extreme political polarization, a very toxic political culture, a very angry, abusive political culture, a kind of zero-sum game in the way people talk. Another is still quite high levels of ethno-nationalism, and intolerance towards minorities. And I think the Gamsakhurdia legacy has been sort of suppressed rather than addressed. He was, no subsequent leader has really talked about him, addressed the issue. People still tend to blame Russia rather than Gamsakhurdia for the conflicts that broke out, although I would say that Gamsakhurdia had a leading role in both those conflicts that still bedevil Georgia. Mikhail Saakashvili, the so-called pro-Western president of Georgia, was also a nationalist and had Gamsakhurdia's body reburied in the so-called pantheon of Georgian heroes on the hill overlooking Tbilisi. And we did so I would sort of commend this article called Struggle and sacrifice narratives of Georgia's modern history that I edited, part of a series we did on called Future of Georgia by Katie Sartania, a young Georgian scholar, where we did some polling, and Georgians' attitudes towards Gamsakhurdia are still overwhelmingly positive. 76% of Georgians say that his overthrow was a bad thing for Georgia. 50% say without Gamsakhurdia, Georgia could not have become independent. They personally attribute Georgia's independence to Gamsakhurdia rather than to the other factors we've been talking about, like, the Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And only 21% believe that he was responsible for starting the wars in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I find those figures quite worrying. I think Georgians need to have more of a debate about this Gamsakhurdia period, about this extreme nationalism that overtook them, which they have largely shed but don't really talk about. And I would even sort of say that Georgia can only really make the next steps in its history towards Europe, towards hopefully being some kind of liberal democracy, if they do address those issues, which, are very strongly associated with Gamsakhurdia and that era.
I just want to ask you a couple of questions about Georgia's position in sort of global politics. Georgia wants to join NATO. Much of the foreign policy establishment there is pretty set on that. Mm-hmm. This would be interesting for all sorts of reasons, not least because it would require NATO to expand further eastward yet again, right into the underbelly of Russia. Given what happened in 2008 when Russia launched an invasion of northern Georgia, their reasons for joining are pretty obvious. It would make Georgia safer. Would it make Europe safer? And by that I mean the part of the continent that's already in NATO and the EU.
Well, this is a huge topic. It's hard to give a short answer to that question. Obviously, first thing we have to say is the war in Ukraine has changed everything in that region. People like me were a bit skeptical about Georgia's NATO perspective for some reasons. I think that it would worsen Georgia's conflicts, that it might just antagonize Russia without making things better. But now look at what Russia's doing in Ukraine. The case has to be made again. The problems remain, but the overwhelming issue, which is that these countries that border Russia, deserve to be defended against Russian aggression. That is now the overwhelming factor. So, and that applies to both Ukraine and Georgia. And I still, it'll still be very problematic if they do join NATO. But that they do need some very, very binding security guarantees for the future against Russia. That's for sure. But I think the other story that's going on is the EU, thanks to the war in Ukraine, becoming a much stronger geopolitical actor. That its eastern neighbourhood was the story. There was that these countries weren't going to get membership. There would be some kind of slow technocratic normative convergence with them. They would get some benefits of being close to the EU, but enlargement wasn't going to happen. And now, thanks to the war in Ukraine, Ukraine and Moldova are being given candidate status. Enlargement is back on the agenda. And Georgia is slightly behind them in the queue because of this rather bizarre government, which is increasingly illiberal and problematic. So Georgia has been actually set 12 conditions by the EU before it can get candidate status, but it's certainly got a much better and bigger offer than it had, before the Ukraine war started. So everything has changed. I think Georgia now is being given a European perspective, if we put it that way. And that's where I think the vast bulk of society wants to see it go. The government is very strange, to put it mildly, doesn't want to talk about the war, is keeping its head down. But I think the government is out of step with the majority of Georgian society on this one, who see a clear path towards the EU and also ultimately, I think, towards NATO as well.
I mean, it brings up an interesting question of whether, for Georgians, is Europeanness something that they can feel, or is it something that we have to ascribe to them, I suppose? I mean, if you, I suppose the counter argument on the Ukraine comparison would be that I think people acknowledge now that Ukraine being left kind of neutral as a blank space on the chessboard, as it were, made Europe and NATO quite vulnerable, because Ukraine has borders, I think, with 4 NATO countries. Georgia is right on the periphery of Europe. It's got a border with Russia. It's close to Iran, and it only borders one NATO ally, and it's probably the most unreliable one of the lot, which is Turkey. I mean, I don't want to sort of fall into the kind of small countries of which we know little syndrome, but it would be like an appendage, really, and it's in some ways a bigger step than incorporating Bulgaria or Estonia or Poland. I was trying to come up with a sort of reason why caution might be the best policy, and that struck me just looking at the map.
I think certainly that would have been the view a year ago if we'd been having this conversation of a lot of people, is that Georgia is a bit of a step too far. It's out there in the European periphery in the South Caucasus. But I think there are some pretty strong counter arguments, that there is this younger generation who does feel European. Their Europeanness is obviously quite different from the Europeanness of Belgium or of Spain or of Ireland. But, Europeanness comes in many forms, and there are, Bulgaria is also quite different culturally from those countries. But I think smallness can be an asset, in the sense that to turn around a country of 4 or 5 million people is actually easier than Ukraine, which has got 40 million people, which is actually a bigger ask. It's absolutely needed, but let's not underestimate the challenge of this huge country of Ukraine, with many, people bordering Russia, with the huge destruction that it suffered. So I would say that compared to Ukraine, maybe Georgia is actually in some ways an easier ask. It will extend the borders of Europe by quite a long way, but there's that active debate going on in the EU about a European political community, about that there can be interim steps before these countries ever get full membership. They can partake of some of the benefits of EU membership and not others. So I think treat these countries on their merits rather than be too geographically deterministic about them.
Just have one more question. Georgia is very far away from the capitals of the big powers that in many ways determine its future. It's very far from Brussels. It's even further away from Washington. It's far from Moscow. It's far from Beijing. People see them as not quite Asian, not quite European, something in between. Does it feel... I don't want people to think I'm using this term pejoratively, because I quite like remote places, but does it feel remote when you go there? I say that as somebody who hasn't been.
No, I wouldn't. I would say it doesn't. I think this is the great trick of Georgia since the Shevardnadze period, and I would credit Shevardnadze for this, and also in a different way Saakashvili, who I had many problems with, but was also very, very good at this, which is selling Georgia, using Georgian charm to put Georgia on the map in Washington, in Europe, I lived in Washington for a while, and you would go to the Georgian embassy parties in Washington, and you could hardly believe this was not a country of 100 million people, not 4 million people, because the show they put on, the people that would come, the case they made for Georgia. And that's really, in fact, the antithesis of the Gamsakhurdia period, when, was this idea of this kind of small Caucasian isolationist nation that Gamsakhurdia had no interest in building relations with the West. He just wanted Georgia to be this kind of medieval Christian place, anything so long as it was free of Russia. And I think, the Georgians have done a pretty good job in their soft power is in some ways second to none. So that's one of their biggest assets, I would say.
I'd love to go. Tom, thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. If people want to find your work about Georgia and about the wider Caucasus region, where can you direct them towards?
Well, thank you, Tom. On the Carnegie Europe website, there's a little profile page where you can read my articles. I guess in terms of my books, the one most relevant to this conversation is called The Caucasus: An Introduction. It has a lot about Gamsakhurdia, Georgian history, modern Georgia, the conflicts, about the Caucasus as a region. And there's a series of essays, I've mentioned one of them by Katie Sartania, a project we did recently on different aspects of Georgia, which we called Future of Georgia, and that's a Carnegie Europe project. So if plenty of reading there out there online for you to look into.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.